Welcome to this episode of the Partovi Effect. My name is Mrs. Madi Partovi,
And I'm Dr. Ryan Partovi.
and since we last saw you, the hepatitis B vaccine has been removed from the vaccine schedule for infants. And that is great timing for this episode.
So, this is our very first interview episode, and it is with
Dr. Joel Warsh.
Dr. Joel Warsh, and who is a pediatrician in California, who how would you describe Dr. Warsh?
Oh gosh, he is a champion of critical thinking. He is an author. He's authored Between a Shot and a Hard Place.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say that he is someone who is very much a fan of vaccine choice. That basically parents need to be fully informed and give full consent. That's informed consent. And um, he doesn't take a strong opinion one way or the other on any particular vaccine or vaccination in general, but he's a big believer in vaccine choice. And I think that's a fair characterization. Would you say that's a
Yes.
fair characterization?
Mhm.
Yeah. So, one of the things that well, first, actually, before I get into that, why don't you say what did you really enjoy about this interview?
Uh,
What was your favorite part?
I was also going to mention that he's an entrepreneur, which
Hmm.
is a right in itself. I mean, the mindsets that you navigate, being an entrepreneur, and he's a unique person. He's
When you say he's an entrepreneur, say more about that. Like, what is his business?
so he's in private practice.
Hmm.
There are no strings on him.
Okay, so you mean he's a doctor in private practice when you by entrepreneur?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Just want to make sure everyone else is
And
clear.
he's an author. I mean,
It is actually, and that's a good point. I mean, being in private practice is an entrepreneurial endeavor because you're not relying on, a big hospital system to basically cover you if you have a slow month, because, well, you've got this multi-million-dollar machine running in the background that's able to kind of say, oh, well, this department didn't do as well this month, so we can offset that and make sure everybody still gets their paychecks. It's like, nope, if you have a bad month, you have a bad month. And, you might be robbing Peter to pay Paul to get everybody's paychecks paid.
yeah.
So
So let me answer your
it's
question.
it's inherently more difficult to, you know, be in private practice.
Mhm.
I just wanted to say that because most people hear entrepreneur and they think like, oh, they've started some business where they're selling something, not, oh, it's a medical practice, but he's in private practice, which I think it's important people understand that medicine is an industry and people in medicine, every single person in medicine is part of that industry to some degree. We're in a privileged position, I think, because we're both part of the system, but we don't profit from the system, which means we're able to critique it in a unique way. But we certainly do, um, have a private practice where we do make money for our family to be able to meet our needs. But I think that, I don't know, do you get what I'm saying? When I hear entrepreneur, I think of something different than just a doctor in private practice.
Yes. I, I'm definitely referring to the spirit that an entrepreneur possesses. Um, you go through a unique set of challenges. You develop a very unique mindset. You're a free agent. You know, you there is um, an integrity, that you put forth, that you come from, a foundation of integrity, that you like us, we start from everything natural, is that
Right,
fair
but
to
I
say?
but I don't see how that, so, not to be difficult here,
Okay, yeah, yeah,
because our goal was not to create some super long intro to this interview, um but to just push back a little bit, I don't see how courage, willingness to stand up against the establishment is inherently like has anything to do with entrepreneurship. To me, entrepreneurship is, yeah, willing to take risks, but they're usually like risks in terms of, hey, I'm willing to spend money to make money. I'm willing to stick my neck out by put mortgaging my home in order to start my business because I really believe that what my business provides is something that has value for people. When I hear entrepreneurship, that's what I'm thinking. I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, I'm going to go and fight against the medical establishment. But I hear what you're saying is that in a medical context, being in private practice means being to some degree having that entrepreneurial spirit and applying it to the medical world, which can often look like, not always, but can often look like a greater willingness to go up against whatever the establishment narrative may be. And you see that reflected in Dr. Warsh.
yes. Let me give you an example,
Okay.
like the FLCCC,
Right.
which is now the Independent Medical
Mhm.
Association. That was a group of MDs that became they were entrepreneurial in creating that entity.
Well, what's funny is most of them, when they created it, were actually faculty members at major medical institutions. So they weren't like, some sort of inherently entrepreneurial people, but they chose to become entrepreneurial. I think pretty much all of them at this point are, in fact, now in private practice when they were, in academic medicine when the whole COVID thing started. So
So thank you. That is exactly what
so
I'm
they were
pointing to.
willing to
Yes.
become entrepreneurial in order to stand for what mattered to them. And I think that that's,
In the words of Marianne Williamson, that little willingness, to start that thing. That
yeah, I mean, I think that there has to be, I think this is so good that we're talking about this because I think it's really sort of when the cow eats the cabbage, where the rubber meets the road. It's this conversation that distinguishes, um, I think, a lot of people who maybe didn't necessarily agree with the establishment narrative on COVID, but didn't want to risk losing their job, didn't want to risk getting fired, didn't want to risk getting blacklisted. And so they said, well, I'm just going to go along with it instead of saying, well, no, I'm going to, as you said, the founders of the FLCCC, I'm going to risk all of it and basically start an organization that's a group of COVID dissidents. And if I have to go into private practice, I'll go into private practice. Um,
so thank you for peeling the onion that's in my mind about this, because this is exactly um, when you're in a corporation or when you're kind of held by the strings of hospital admin or in a system, you're not most likely you're not going to um, rock the boat or and if you're going to leave this system like those doctors did, you're going to start your own organization. You're going to be a free thinker and say, okay, what kind of new system in parallel can I create, in order to have integrity and speak my truth or the truth.
right. Well, and I think that that is an important distinction. And I will just say I'm reminded in this conversation of a conversation I had with my friend John Block, who, his work is literally empowering people to branch out from corporate America, create their own business, and also create their own tribe and events, and that's his whole world. Um, but a conversation he and I had many years ago in which um, he was talking about how basically there are people who are still in corporate America and kind of have their, they have sort of one toe in the water of entrepreneurship and they're sort of curious about, okay, what would it take? And then you have people who have like, they've made the call. They're like, I'm done. I'm quitting. I put in my notice. I'm starting a business. And then you have people who are 1 year in, 2 years in, 5 years in. And, he was talking about it from the context of coaching and like, hey, you can choose to coach people at any of these different points, and different people at different points need different coaching. But I think that the whole conversation is one that points to what I think is the future of our country, which is more and more entrepreneurship and more willingness to embark on this journey, because I think it's the only way people can really, um, well, I shouldn't say the only way. I would say it's one of the most powerful ways that people can really live a life of integrity. And that was never explained to me as a child. My father's a restaurant entrepreneur. He's an entrepreneur. And so I grew up in a house of entrepreneurship, but it was never talked about as like, this is the future, this is the American dream, this is what it's all about, this is what you want to do. It was more like, go be a doctor, be a lawyer, become a professional so you don't have to worry about entrepreneurship. But it's like, actually, without entrepreneurship, you really don't have a whole lot of freedom. You're within a system. And this, I'm sorry, I said we are going to do a short intro. Obviously, I lied. But this reminds me of an interview I saw with Sam Harris and on trigonometry this week. I was listening to this, and Sam is someone that I feel very conflicted about because he was one of the founders of the intellectual dark web, the IDW, which I have a lot of respect for. But there was a big split that happened in COVID where he sort of really clung to the establishment view on COVID. And then you had Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying and Joe Rogan and, you know, Pierre Corey and Dr. McCullough, et cetera, who all kind of said, well, Robert Malone, were like, hey, you know, um, this COVID narrative we're being fed is not the whole picture. Let's take a look and see what's so, and really evaluate the evidence as it comes out. And there are other names too that I didn't include there, but that's, the several of the ones who were sort of early to the party, which I think is worth noting. Um, but Sam was like, no, no, we have to stay with the establishment. We have to stick with whatever, CDC is telling us. And in listening to that interview, I figured him out, I think. I really figured out, like, what is it that's makes Sam so different from some of these other guys? And it's because he really is an institutionalist. He really believes that, like, he believes in institutions. He believes that, like, hey, if you have an institution, sure, is there going to be corruption, on the top 5% or the bottom 5% on the edges? Sure. But the middle 90%, the consensus of the particular institution, whatever it might be, whether it's medicine, whether it be, politics, whether it be science, whether it be ethics and, philosophy, whatever it is, if it's the middle 90%, that consensus, whatever that expert consensus is of the institution, that's probably the closest we can get to truth at any particular moment. And that's his worldview. And so I think, but when I listen to him talk, I'm like, oh, you have not yet seen the level of corruption in the way that you and I have seen it in institutions, such that you've started to become skeptical of them. And I think part of the reason why he has that view, and I think this is worth noting, is for him as an atheist, he's an atheist, the institution that's all he's got. It's like empirical observation inside institutions that humans create. As a secular humanist, he's one of the leaders of the new atheists. That's all you got. If you don't have that, everything else just falls apart. So it's like, well, if I can't trust humanity, if I can't trust the collective consensus of human experts, what can I trust? And I think for us, coming from a worldview where it's like, well, science is simply a way to get closer to God, right? Like everything starts and ends with God. Because we come from that worldview, the Christian worldview, it's very easy for us to see how a human institution could become corrupted, even if it reflects the quote majority consensus 90%. I said this to a patient this week because I do a lot of cancer these days. Cancer is predominantly what I'm doing. And so he's a cancer patient. And he said to me, Dr. Partovi, I've gone to see this cancer doctor and that doctor, and they're all like, we don't really understand what you're doing with Dr. Partovi. And it's like, yeah, I told him, I said, yeah, I could tell you that 90% of doctors you're going to go see are going to tell you one of a few things. Number one, I don't know why you're doing what you're doing. Number two, no, that doesn't work. Or number three, that's crazy. You should go do chemo, radiation, or whatever they're selling. So I said to him, I said, yeah, of course, that's what you would expect from 95% of doctors out there. And then I could point you to 5%. I can give you a list who will at least acknowledge what I'm doing and saying, yeah, that's good. Keep doing that. And then I can even give you a shorter list people who would say, yeah, I would do exactly what he's doing, and this is my approach that I'm doing too. But it's the tiny minority. Just like during COVID, we were the minority recommending ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. So you can't say to yourself, well, gee, I mean, you can do whatever you want. We believe in freedom and choice. But it's like, well, I'm gonna see corruption during COVID and the COVID vaccine and people not prescribing ivermectin, and we're going to see that that was a problem. But then, like, when it comes to my cancer, I'm going to go and just do whatever my medical oncologist, my medical oncologist tells me I should do, even though he's making 60 to 70% of his annual income from the markup on chemotherapy that he's, you know, charging your insurance for. And, that's, and look, hey, I have no problem with that. That's his business model. He's got to put his kids through private school too. That's a joke. But the point is, if you're making 60 to 70% of your income from your chemotherapy markup and you're recommending chemotherapy to the vast majority of people who walk through your door, isn't that something you should let them know? In our practice, we make 10% of our monthly income from the nutraceutical sales that I recommend. We're very open about that. And the good thing about nutraceuticals, natural medicines, is that, if theoretically you might say, well, there's a conflict of interest, you're making money off of things you're recommending, fair. But like, let's say I prescribe one or two more things that maybe you benefit from, but don't technically are necessary according to like some objective standard that theoretically exists. Okay, well, so now you're going to have some side benefits that you wouldn't otherwise have, right? Versus side effects or, something that might literally make you sicker, which is very commonly the case when it comes to chemotherapy. So, anyway, all this to say that I've been fascinated by looking at how the acceptance of the existence of God and using that as the foundation can give you the worldview or the framework to actually be able to understand corruption of human institutions, to be able to understand how not only COVID happened the way it happened, but also the way that our cancer industry exists the way that it exists, and understand that, yeah, there's a minority out there that are doing integrous work in the world of integrative oncology, but we are by far the minority, just like those of us that were prescribing ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, et cetera, during COVID were by far the minority. And many doctors said, "Oh, I refuse to prescribe that." Okay, well, that's their integrity. But anyway, all of this to get back to Dr. Warsh, who basically is
Yes. So I'm going to answer your question
okay.
about my favorite part of the interview.
Yes.
Was when I was quite present to the fact that through all of his conventional medical studies, through that path, he he asked questions, and he continued to ask questions, and he continued to question what he was, spoon-fed in medical school. And It really gave rise to his movement.
Yeah. By his movement, you're talking about the fact that he personally moved from being someone who was just 100%,
Yes,
oh, vaccine safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective, CDC,
yes,
guidelines, to now being someone who's a advocate for vaccine choice and has become somewhat skeptical, at least of, you know, or I don't know if I would say skeptical. I would say he's very curious about the trade-offs and risk benefits for the different vaccines.
yeah.
And that's actually a great segue to my favorite part, which was really, or what I wanted to highlight anyway, which is that there was a point in the interview, which is coming up, where I asked him a question and I said, do you see it that perhaps the increase in vaccination over the last 70 plus years has led to a trade-off in which we've had less morbidity and mortality from acute illness, infectious disease, but increased morbidity and mortality from chronic disease? And I'm not going to tell you what he said, but I will say that his response led me to say, well, I want to do a deep dive and I want to find out what the evidence actually shows regarding the answer to that question. So I did that, and I, as a result, created my first Substack, which I'm going to share with you guys. I'll show you a little glimpse of it, but then we'll put in the show notes, we'll put a link to my Substack. And the Substack for this episode is Vaccination, Infectious Disease, and Chronic Illness, Investigating a Potential Trade-off. Did you want to just read the introduction, maybe? I think that would be a good thing to share with them.
Vaccination has undeniably saved millions of people from acute infectious disease deaths. The hypothesis posed is that this public health triumph may come with a hidden trade-off, an increase in chronic diseases, allergies, autoimmune conditions, neurodevelopmental disorders, etc., as an unintended consequence of widespread immunization programs. In evolutionary biology, it's well understood that many interventions involve trade-offs. Improving one outcome can inadvertently affect another. Some researchers, including evolutionary biologists like Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang, have discussed how biological systems make compromises, raising the question of whether reducing childhood infections through vaccines might alter immune system development in ways that elevate long-term chronic disease risk. This deep dive examines the evidence, epidemiological, clinical, and mechanistic, behind the notion that vaccines or their components could contribute to chronic disorders even as they curb acute infectious illness. We focus on studies that explicitly compare vaccinated versus unvaccinated populations and on research into common vaccine ingredients like aluminum adjuvants and other immunostimulants in relation to autoimmune, allergic, and neurodevelopmental outcomes. The goal is to present the currently available evidence supporting this hypothesis, while acknowledging gaps and suggesting future research pathways, with particular scrutiny on evidence that might be underrepresented in mainstream literature. All sources are cited for transparency. That's great.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting review that I did, and I think it'll be, I think our viewers will find it interesting, and listeners. If you're just listening, then you may need to go to the YouTube in order to see the link, or you can just search for Dr. Partovi. So that's Dr. like the abbreviation for doctor, and then our last name, P as in Paul, A-R, T as in Thomas, O, V as in violin, I. Hopefully you know how to spell it because you're watching the Partovi effect. But it's at Dr. Partovi is the way you search for. It's the I guess, the handle on Substack. And there should be more Substacks coming as we go through and I investigate other things. I'm working on one right now looking at um, the COVID vaccine and COVID boosters and long COVID. Because a narrative we're hearing a lot lately has been, oh, be sure to get COVID boosted. You don't want to get long COVID. And, what's interesting is I do sometimes see some friends citing certain studies which seem to kind of support the idea that maybe there's some benefit there. But I think what you'll find when you read my review is that the preponderance of the evidence shows that, in fact, there's no benefit, and in fact, may actually be a small signal for increased risk from getting boosted. So I wrote this article not for the true believers out there who are already opposed to the COVID vaccine, but this is more of a scientific review article for you to send to your friends and family who are continuing to get boosted. So when that is out, we will talk about it more and present it on here. That'll probably be in an episode or two. We'll go over that. But just, stay tuned because our goal there is to ultimately just help to illustrate for people that they may have been misled on that relationship between the COVID vaccine reducing the risk of long COVID. Anything you want to say about that?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like it's obvious.
Then yes,
It's
right now.
yeah. It's one of those things where it's like obvious to us, but like we need to get an actual evidence-based review out there because I don't think anybody has really done that. Looking at the question, like bringing all the evidence together and saying, "Hey guys, cut it out." And so that's what this is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, not that. Well, yeah. I mean, you'll see that we'll present it. And you'll see my hypothesis, and we'll see the evidence for it, and y'all can judge for yourselves.
Well, here it is. A pediatrician that does not toe the line. I'm excited to create a dialogue that invites people to take a deeper look into what's available to them, the information and the knowledge that's available to them, that will open up a whole new world of looking at health and wellness, at vaccines, at parenting. So thank you. Thank you for being open to joining us today, Dr. Joel.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat.
Beautiful. Um, Dr. Ryan.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to know a little bit more about you. If you could just kind of tell us, your story and or what you want people to know about you, I guess is what I would say.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a pediatrician. I work in Los Angeles. I practice integrative medicine. So I try to balance the best of modern medicine with alternative and holistic practices and focus a little bit more on prevention and nutrition and diet and modifiable lifestyle factors. I did all the regular medical training. I got a little bit frustrated with modern medicine and really just treatments for everything and started seeing people getting better, going outside the system. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that and also met my now wife during my training, and she's very holistic minded. So all those things kind of together open up my eyes to a little bit of a different perspective. And so I started learning and training in some integrative medicine, and I tried to blend the best of both worlds together. And that's what I do today.
Okay, great.
I know that you probably said that a million times by now.
I mean, different forms of it. Yeah. I mean, usually get
Yeah.
like, oh, what's integrative medicine or what, because I think it's just not, I mean, I think it's more popular now or more well known, but it certainly is still newer. And I think not everyone really understands what that means, or they've heard the term integrative or alternative, and I think it's really woo woo and out there. And that's kind of the way that I learned it, right? Originally, when I was in training, it's like, oh, alternative medicine, it's all woo out there stuff. And then the reality is, once you start learning about it, you're like, wow, there's nothing woo woo about this. It's like really common sense and really the things we should be being taught. I mean, you can get pretty out there, you can get pretty woo woo, but mostly it's not. I mean, there's nothing woo woo about thinking about your food.
Thank you. Thank you for that deeper cut into who you are and what you stand for. And
I'm wondering something before we move on beyond that. You mentioned your wife, and we're a husband and wife team, so I'm always curious. You mentioned your wife is kind of holistically minded. Is she also in the medical space or?
No, she's a lawyer actually.
Oh, okay. Got
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of law in my background as well. Um,
so speaking of Dr. Joel's wife, I do know that she opened up for you or provided an access for you uh, that expanded your world and your way of thinking
Definitely.
in the early days, like immediately after you met.
Yeah, I think that that's really what opened up my eyes to a different perspective. I wouldn't say I was particularly holistic minded or anything when I was growing up. I was pretty healthy. I played lots of sports. I was active, but I wasn't really thinking about it. I certainly ate more junk food and fast food, and it wasn't really a thought when I was younger. I wasn't like sick all the time or particularly unhealthy, but I never really considered that. And certainly during medical school, it wasn't something that really crossed my mind. But seeing the way that I felt better after eating the food that she was preparing or just thinking about things in a different way, it really helped to give me a different perspective, which I think is really important because especially with medicine and in many ways, we kind of only see one side of things. And unless you're exposed to something else, you don't really know. And that exposure really helped to get me going on a path, I guess, that was, I think I'm an open-minded person. So it opened up my mind to a different side to start learning about it.
Beautiful. Would you say that it was love that opened you up to this world?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's love. And just also, I mean, it could have been just a friend. I think it could have been anybody, but it was just somebody to give me some exposure to a different
Cool.
world. But I think that, being in a relationship and kind of seeing the progression and the change and being around someone who's that way a little bit more, I think it's like it's the constant exposure that really I think makes a huge difference about pushing you to if you want to. I mean, if you're open to it, pushing you to kind of learn more about that. And I feel like I'm pretty open-minded.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's how I see you, actually. So that pathway that opened you up, like you're offering that to the world now. You're offering that to people.
Yeah, I think that over time it's something that really has grown. It's not something I expected to be doing. It's not something I had ever imagined practicing in that way, certainly when I started med school. So I think it has grown from that. And even, the topic of vaccines, which obviously is so controversial. The last place I ever thought I would be writing a vaccine book or talking about vaccines all the time. And that's just something that's grown out of the questions that parents have had for me and the exposure that I've had to an integrative space, which is not something I would have imagined back then. But as soon as you get in an integrative space, a lot of parents have questions about vaccines. And so I had no choice but to learn about it and to be able to answer those questions. And I got more and more frustrated around that space and the censorship. And that's what led me to want to write a book ultimately, especially during COVID when I was very frustrated. And I want people to be able to discuss it. I don't think we should have topics that are too taboo to discuss. Like integrated medicine shouldn't be taboo. Vaccine shouldn't be taboo. We should be able to talk about it. You don't have to agree with what I think. You don't have to agree with whoever thinks, but you should be able to refute it with better information. And that's really the scope that I've come at it with, and that's been the evolution of my career. I think it's just being open-minded to hearing other people, and then taking some of that in and trying to learn more about it.
Great. Tell us a bit more about your book.
So the between a shot and a hard place, it really what I tried to do was try to give a balanced approach. It's not trying to convince anybody to do anything, to get vaccines or not get vaccines. It's really an exploration of vaccines and running through the big questions that people had. I as I was in practice, what was really difficult when people asked me like, what should I read? What should I do? If I have questions, and what I noticed through the literature was a lot of stuff is very one-sided. So you have the very like CDC perspective, vaccines are the best thing ever, they never cause a problem. Or you have the other books, which are like, these are the worst things ever, you should never get it, don't touch a vaccine ever in your life. And most people are somewhere in the middle. I think these days, a lot of parents have questions, they might have some concerns, but they're not really, air quotes, anti-vax. They just have some questions around it and they want to understand a little bit more. And I think that most of the literature out there is pretty one-sided and doesn't really address some of the big questions that parents have, or certainly there are many things that we're kind of told or taught that aren't necessarily totally true, or maybe the evidence isn't as strong as we're led to believe. And I think that's really important to understand, so that way we can continue to get that research, continue to improve, and always have the best possible products for our kids. And I don't think parents shouldn't be able to ask questions. I think it's reasonable to have concern around something you're injecting multiple into your kid, and you should be able to ask questions about that. And our job as physicians and as scientists should be to get as much information as we can, to study them as much as we can, to make them as safe as we can, to make them as effective as we can. And there shouldn't be anything controversial about that. And it just seems lately, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, that instead of having discussions, it's moved more to like, just do it because I say so. And I think that's not really working very well. And we certainly saw it not work very well during and after COVID. And I think we need a reality check and a little bit of humility in medicine to understand the concerns that parents have and start addressing them, and start getting, I think, further research on the concerns that parents have instead of just saying, oh, it's settled.
Yeah. So, that brings up a few interesting questions for me. I think my first one is, what do you feel like are the questions that parents have that are either ignored, glossed over, not adequately addressed by the conventional establishment?
I think the
Propaganda, for lack of a better word.
yeah, I mean, I think the big one is around risks for vaccines. I think that people have a lot of concerns around side effects and long-term complications potentially of vaccines, and they don't feel like those are addressed. And the reality is it's not really addressed. I mean, most of the research is very short term, and the vast majority of the research is pre-licensure done by the companies. Maybe a couple months of the studies are, maybe 6 months, maybe a year or two if you're very lucky, but rarely, almost never, is it followed for many years. We don't have studies on the cumulative effect of vaccines. We don't follow them forward. We don't have vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies. It just doesn't exist. So it makes for reasonable questions when we have a chronic disease epidemic like we have, where about 50% of kids have a chronic disease and 75% of adults have a chronic disease. And parents see that every day, and they wonder, do vaccines play any part in that? What part do they play? If my kid is more sensitive, should I be more worried? I'm seeing all these vaccines now. When I was growing up, oh, I only got like 5, or I got 10, and my kids have to get 30, 40. Is that okay? Like, I don't think those are unreasonable questions to ask. And I think medicine should be doing everything possible to answer those questions and to study those questions and to continue to try to make vaccines as safe as possible, and not just say, oh, they could never cause a problem, or it was 1 in a million, when I think that's probably not true. And I think that we need to study exactly what the long-term complications could be, so we can try to make them safer and better, and see which kids might be the sensitive ones, or maybe the kids that we can identify who would be more likely to have a reaction, and we can minimize that. And I don't think that should be anti-science or anti-vaccine to say. It's not something against vaccines. It's just we want them to be as safe and as effective as possible. And I feel like the discussion is just about decreasing diseases, and it's never, or almost never, about reducing risk from the vaccines. It's almost like vaccines can never cause a problem. And then you get the propaganda, like you said, like safe and effective, which is what we had during the pandemic. And I think that's where medicine lost so many people and just completely lost trust, because I think most people realize, like, wait, it can't be safe. Like, how do we know that it's safe? You could say, what we know so far is it seems like it's safe. We've studied it for a few months. We haven't seen any major signals. We'll continue to study it. It seems like the benefits outweigh the risks, but we don't really know anything about long-term risks, so we recommend it. But what people saw was, no, it's safe and effective. You have to get it. We're going to require you to get it. And that is a really, I think, not the right message to be sending from public health. And it just really lost people. And I think trust in medicine is gone because people feel like they were lied to. And then they start wondering, well, if you were lying about this, well, what else are you lying about? Should I not trust all the rest of the vaccines? And that's where we are. And that's why we have the lowest trust in medicine probably ever.
Yeah, it's interesting about lying. I noticed that there was a recent interview that Paul Offit did about the conversation that he and Fauci and some of the other people, the decision makers, had around, you know, whether you want to call it natural immunity or, survivor-induced immunity or whatever, versus the vaccine, and the idea that, well, we all at this table agree and know that natural immunity is superior, and yet we're going to lie to the people and tell them that everybody should get vaccinated because it's too much of a nuanced and complex conversation to tell them the truth.
I've heard him say that too, and I like I hear that I'm like what like
Right.
that's so crazy to me that you feel like a group of people feel like they know something, they know it's scientifically evidence based. It's basically what we've told or done forever, and how we really look at disease. And of course, natural immunity in general is going to be better than a vaccine. It always is going to be, almost, because you're getting immunity from the whole pathogen versus just one little part. Which you put in a vaccine. Now, like you said, and this is the argument. Well, okay, survivor immunity, like you have to not die, right? So that's true. I mean, that's the point of a vaccine. But that doesn't negate anything about the benefits of a vaccine. That the point is, you shouldn't lie to people, because a vaccine could have negative complications, and we're finding out more and more, especially with COVID vaccine, that there are concerns that have been addressed that maybe we didn't know of before. And if you're giving somebody something without a benefit, then you're just exposing them to potential risk, and that's not fair or reasonable or ethical or informed consent in any way. That's just basically lying, or at least just lying by omission. And the fact that they don't think that people could figure this out is ridiculous. It's like, if you had chicken pox, you don't need to get a chicken pox shot. Like, we don't know. So why would it be any different for COVID? Like, if you've had COVID and you test positive and you have antibodies, then there's no reason you should have to go get a vaccine for that same thing, especially in the short term. Like, you just had COVID last week. Like, why would you get a COVID? You're just potentially exposing yourself to negative, and maybe even worse outcomes from future COVID. So why would you want that? And it
Oh,
just
but they were literal, news articles. I mean, doctors were telling patients. I mean, my own father had COVID. I treated him successfully, and then his primary care doctor had him get the vaccine regardless. And I told him don't get it, and he did it because I guess it was, culturally where he lives, it's like was basically impossible to operate without being vaccinated. And I just, yeah, I mean, but it was just, it truly permeated that society to some degree in a way that I find disturbing, to say the least.
it's very disturbing, and it backfired, right? I mean, I get, like, at the moment, forcing people to do something, not telling the whole truth, will get more people to get vaccinated. Like, I'm sure it did, right? Instead of just being like, well, we recommend getting the vaccine in general. If you've had COVID, then you don't need to get it. I think that would have had fewer people get vaccinated, but ultimately would have been more honest. And I think in the long run would be much better, because people would have trust in the things that they say and do what, if you actually do need to get vaccinated for something or do need something, like, you'd actually trust that. But now you sit back, you're like, well, this is what they said. How do we trust anything anymore? And I know a lot of people are like that. I mean, that we're seeing the lowest rates of vaccination, the highest rates of exemptions that we've ever seen before, and the lowest rates of trust in the vaccines and vaccine schedules. And like 50% of people don't want to do the regular schedule, want to do a slow schedule, have questions about it. I mean, it's insane numbers compared to what it used to be. And it's well deserved. When you say things like natural immunity doesn't count, you need to go get a vaccine, or you can't go to work. What do you expect to happen 5 years later, when everyone realizes that that doesn't make any sense? It didn't stop transmission. It didn't protect other people, not really. And natural immunity was totally fine. And they actually knew that. And they were sitting on the table talking about it. And they just decided not to do it because it was, too complicated for the mass, public. We just want them to get vaccinated no matter what. And it's like, well, then you are asking for people to get complications that didn't need to, and potentially giving people worse immunity to other diseases, or even to COVID, if you're just vaccinating them when they don't need it. And how that affects your immune system, we don't always know, and certainly didn't know back then. So you're giving someone a product which could have a negative with no benefit. And that's just wrong. It's just not right to do. And so now when people don't trust them, I understand why, and it makes it really difficult as to where we are. And again, back to where I really wanted to work on a book and work on having discussions on vaccines, because I think it's really important that we are able to have discussions like this and have debates and talk about it. And if we can't talk about it, then we're going to go in a very wrong direction. But hopefully, if we can talk about it, then we can figure out a better path forward. And it's been nice to see that people are much more open to talking about it now. It's a very different place, and things are not really getting censored, which is good. But a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to exemptions in a minute, but I had a question for you on the vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies. Because to me, the fact that there've really only ever been like maybe you know, 2 or 3 of those ever published, and I think 1 or 2 of them have been retracted. And and every time one gets published, it's totally dogpiled. I mean, everybody just picks it apart and tries to find any excuse to get it retracted. And that in general, there's just those studies don't really, they're not out there. Um, to me, that's a red flag. Like in and of itself, like on its face, that's a red flag. Now, why do you think that in the conventional medical world, that is not seen as more of a red flag than I see it as?
I think that most doctors don't know. I think that
Okay.
most people don't know. If I think back to when I was in training or when I was in early practice, I just assumed that vaccines were studied so well and so robustly, and we had so much data based on what you're told and what you're taught that you just assume that this has all been done. I mean, it's been done pre-licensure. They're following it. They have all these resources. We know the vaccines are so safe. We have all this stuff, so you don't actually go look at it yourself. And even if you do go kind of look at it, you look at like a web page and like, oh, look at all these studies that look at vaccines. Okay, it's like that. That's pretty much all you think about it when you're in med school or let's say residency. You get taught about the horrible diseases. You get taught about how great the vaccines were, how many diseases we don't have anymore, and like, yay, vaccines, here's your schedule, go do them. And that's mostly what you learn. You don't learn about why to question it, or you don't really dig into the research that much. So I think that most people just don't know. And as soon as you do start to look into it, you're like, wait, like what? Like that, where is this research? We were told it was here. Like, why don't we have it? And like you said, a lot of stuff is either retracted or kind of piled on when it does come out. And we really don't have vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies. I mean, there's just a couple that are kind of mediocre, I guess, and epidemiologic and retrospective. And even the ones that were done are kind of either not published or retracted in general. And then the other ones, when they're like, oh yeah, we do unvaccinated studies. And it's like, no, you don't. They're like vaccinated. They're like one vaccine you don't get versus like, let's say like there's MMR studies, right? So it's like you got
Right.
MMR versus not get MMR in the setting of getting your other vaccines. So they're not
Right.
vaccinated. They just don't get one of the vaccines. So it's like, that's, you can still glean something from that. But when you're doing 10 vaccines versus 11, it's like, well, that's not really the question you're trying to answer. So I also think, the only thing that I can think is it's a red flag. I think doing a prospective study needs to be done, but obviously it's very complicated and very expensive. But I think we're at the point where we absolutely need it. And it should be done. I think they can very much ethically do it. It just, I don't think you could do like a randomized trial. That'd be very hard to do these days ethically, but you can certainly have people choose. And there are plenty of people that are unvaccinated that would happily volunteer for that study, and you just don't force anybody to do any vaccines or not get vaccines, and they can always switch groups if they want to, but you could still certainly do that and follow kids forward. So I do think we need that. But the red flag to me is the fact that we don't have database studies that go back in time looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated. As someone who's done a master's in epidemiology, you know how very not difficult that is to do. Like you could very easily get
Yeah.
a database, get all the kids that are vaccinated, all the kids that are unvaccinated, study them, put them in different models, look at all kinds of different things. You can have that output, and you can do it in a few minutes and get the basic output. And you can there's a lot of confounding and other issues, but you could do it, right? You could do it. You could look at as many things as you can. You can look at it in multiple different ways. So the fact that hasn't been done, to me, it's just two things. Either it has been done, and the things that people find they don't like what they found, and so they just don't publish it, or there's just this push, like you said, and like I believe where someone does publish something that they kind of get pushback, it ruins their career, so they just don't either want to study that at all, or even if they do find it, they don't want to publish that research, and so they just kind of just doesn't go anywhere. So yeah, I think there's a lot of bias in that world, and especially with epidemiology, you can kind of mold the data how you want. So if you're very pro-vaccine, you can find something that's pro-vaccine, and if you find any problems with your data, then you can be like, what did I do wrong? Let me readjust this model until I find what I want to find. So that's the downside of epidemiology is you can adjust it many times, and you're supposed to adjust the data, but you're supposed to adjust it correctly. But you can also adjust a finding that should actually be there. So that's why we need the prospective studies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, not to interrupt you, but I think that you're absolutely right that we should have, probably dozens, if not more, retrospective studies at this point, looking at, the data that we do have that we're not doing. And I think you bring up an excellent point there about confounders and the way that confounders are massageable or manipulatable by the researchers. I think one of the most interesting ones that I've seen multiple times is, oh, well, the reason why the unvaccinated group rather had fewer diagnoses of like asthma and atopic conditions was because they received less health care. And it's like, well, or maybe they went to the doctor less often because they have fewer problems, right? Like,
Right. Well, that's exactly it. I mean, in the book, I talk about that a good chunk because that's always the way that they get rid of the signal, right? In a study. And so, I mean, it automatically removes it basically because you're basically like, well, if people don't come in, then they, you have to kind of weight the average based on how often they come in, and the people that don't come in, those are the ones that are more likely to be unvaccinated. So then it washes away any potential signal. And I mean, there is validity to that to some degree. Like, it is absolutely possible that people don't get diagnoses because they don't come in.
sure.
And it's also possible that people who are listed as unvaccinated on your study and on your database, they're unvaccinated because they just don't have data entered, right? So they could
Sure.
actually be vaccinated. They could actually have diagnoses, but maybe they left. Maybe they only had one visit. That is absolutely possible. It needs to be considered in a study. But also, if you are following a kid for, let's say, 10 years and they are coming in intermittently, if a kid has a serious diagnosis, it's going to be, and they're seeing you, like, it's not like I wouldn't see a kid who has asthma ever or like cancer or something, right? Like, they're going to come into the doctor. So, there's also just something to be said that maybe those kids are just healthier and that's why they're not coming in as much. And so, again, that goes back to, this is the downside of retrospective research, because both points can be true. And so you do have to consider that, but you also shouldn't necessarily factor that in. If the reality is they're just coming in less because they're healthier, that's what a prospective trial is for. Right? And that's why you need to take that information. You need to go prospectively, and you need to have kids followed and checked in every few years or whatever. If you're following them, say, for 5 or 10 years, and then you can be like, all right, well, you never came into the doctor, but do you have autism? Do you have asthma? Do you have allergies? What have you been diagnosed? Let's do a check on you. Let's ask you questions. Like, that's the way to get rid of that, because then the visits don't matter. You can have 0 visits, but you can still also not have autism, right? You can diagnose that pretty easily if you have the correct follow-up. So it's just a downside of retrospective research. It's just the reality of it. But
there's also a chilling effect of being unvaccinated, and in most pediatric practices where they don't want you to actually come in if your child is unvaccinated. A lot of pediatric practices mandate, that you follow the schedule.
That is correct, but I still think that, especially with a database like someone like Henry Ford, where they're collecting emergency room data, other things, like, I think you would still be seen if you have serious diagnoses. So I would say, it's very different from, like, let's say, ear infections, right, or ear pain. Like, I think it's very reasonable that someone who's unvaccinated, that doesn't go to the doctor very often, that doesn't feel like they need medicine, would maybe go in less for ear pain and have fewer diagnoses of ear infection. Like, that makes sense to me. That's certainly possible. But someone who has asthma or cancer or autism or whatever, you're still going to the doctor. So unless you're going to a different doctor, you're still going to get seen, whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, because you need medical care. So I don't think those two things are the same. And I think as long as you have a good database that's collecting people, reasonably well and kind of following them forward and actually gets all their visits, I don't think that fewer visits actually matters for those diagnoses. Not in those scenarios.
Right.
So for our audience, in your book, Dr. Joel, you do unpack this quite a bit in chapter 14, vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And I appreciate that look, because it takes a deep dive into all the things that you would have to address, all the problems that you would have to face and the challenges in order to create such a study with integrity. So I appreciate that. To hear an MD talk about such things. And you also bring to light a lot of the hard-hitting cases that Aaron Siri has shared with the world. And I think there's so many parents that don't know about this. I mean, reading through the transcripts.
I didn't know about it, so why would the parents know? Who
Right.
knows? Like, I mean, he's getting more famous now, so I think people are starting to hear it a little bit. But also, you kind of have to be in the world where you even, follow him or follow somebody that even posts about his stuff.
Right.
This stuff is amazing. Like maybe amazing is the wrong word. It needs to be heard. Like you need to hear those cases. You need to read them. It's where I think like it might have been on Rogan or I don't know, somewhere like where he was talking about the Stanley Plotkin.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
And I was like, wait, what? Like maybe I think it was on Tucker Carlson or something. I heard him that he was on there, so I listened to it, and he was like talking about that. I was like, wait, what? And I like go listen to the actual. Like, what is this?
Yes, you and I are going to do it.
Oh, I haven't heard about this.
Yes.
What is this?
So on our next podcast, you and I are going to do. I'll be Aaron Siri, and you be Plotkin, and it'll just like blow people's minds.
Okay.
That these words were spoken.
It's insane. Like, him talking about like the history of vaccines and the studies that were done and the stuff on fetal tissue and aborted fetal tissue, and just kind of like very nonchalantly talking about how the studies were done back in the day and how they got their research and the kids, and they got it from prisons and from other countries. Just like what?
Orphans.
Oh yeah, we just like cut up all the pieces. Like he just like says it so nonchalant, and I get it. Like research was different back then, and you do have to do some research. It always the best things aren't always done to get to where we need to get to today. But still, it's just the way he talks about it, or the way he talks about how religion couldn't or shouldn't play a factor in decision making. It's like so nonchalant the way that he says it, and it's like, well, people, just because you don't believe something doesn't mean someone else doesn't. And even if like the Vatican or whatever says that you can still get a vaccine, doesn't mean that my personal beliefs are that I can inject a fetal aborted tissue into me. Like I don't necessarily like have my own opinion shouldn't matter for what you believe. Like you might just not believe that's okay, or like there are porcine parts in vaccines, so some people like are really against eating that. So why should they not be allowed to be against injecting that? Like that, these are all things that should be reasonable discussions. And just the discussions that are, Dr. Edwards or even Plotkin, where they go like, is there research on this? No. So do you believe this? Like for autism and vaccines, it's like, is there any research on hepatitis B and autism? No. Does Hep B cause autism? No. How do you know that? Well, I don't know, but because there's no research, I say no. And it's like, that's not an answer. Like that's I don't know. It's not a no.
Yeah. Would you agree that essentially what we have done with the vaccination program is to engage? So one of my favorite principles of biology is the idea of trade-offs, sort of the idea that you're not going to be able to, there's no free lunch. And so, to me, the way I see it is that there's been a trade-off, which is that we have decreased morbidity and mortality from infectious disease, while at the same time we've increased chronic disease. And I think that is the degree to which we've increased chronic disease is probably being suppressed to some degree by the lack of research. And I think that isn't to say that, all of the increase in chronic disease comes from the vaccination program, but at least some of it.
Well, I think that's the question, right? that is the right question that we don't have the answer to. And I think that's the missing piece of the risk benefit calculation and the way that we're talking about vaccines. That's just completely glossed over, because I think and this kind of the way I try to structure the book too, is that I think we understand the risk of the disease and the diseases pretty well. We know what they are, how often people get them. We know how severe it can be for some people. So we have that categorized pretty well. I think we have a pretty good understanding.
Well, I would say one other thing about that, though, which is that their terrain matters. And so we may know in sort of broad terms, but then you have like little pockets. For example, like I think all the measles deaths in the last year or two before the vaccine came out were like in rural, impoverished Mississippi. And so presumably nutrient deficient Mississippi, right? And so that's kind of, the other part of it that we think about that I think is you have to kind of put that in. Yeah, we know sort of broadly speaking, but we also don't know what, making sure that having baseline nutrition on board would do to those numbers, because we've never done those studies.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. You're just complicating my point, but it's right. I was trying to make it simple, but yeah, everything said is completely right. And kind of, I think, secondary of an understanding of this. Like I think it's like equally as important, but kind of it just makes it a lot more complicated because it is very complicated. But I think from like I guess a more simplistic standpoint, taking that part out for a second, we kind of understand the diseases, we kind of understand the vaccines and how effective they are. We kind of understand the short-term risks and kind of the fevers and seizures and pain and swelling. Like we have pretty good data on that. I don't think we have good data on long-term health at all. And I think that's the missing piece of the puzzle, because ultimately everything has risks. And the question is, while you might get a benefit of a decrease of a certain disease, at what cost? Right. And right now we say, oh, it's like, well, you mostly get a fever. It's fine. Like 1 in a million is a big problem. And the question is, how much of the chronic disease epidemic, how much are vaccines influencing some of these things? Because that is a huge difference. If it's 25% of chronic disease is exacerbated or even caused by vaccines, that's very different than like 0.01%. Like, yeah, obviously something happens every now and again, but if it's really 1 in a million, then you're probably protecting more people than that with vaccines. But if you're causing, let's say, 25% of autism and increasing your risk of asthma by 10 times and increasing your risk of autoimmune condition by 4 times, like whatever, I'm just making up those numbers, but that changes the risk equation, especially when you're talking about diseases which are very rare now. And so I think that is a really important piece that we need to understand, because ultimately, if a vaccine does cause more problems than it helps, that doesn't mean the vaccine doesn't have use. It just means, well, maybe we have to make a safer, better vaccine, or maybe we have to look at, do we need this vaccine versus that vaccine? Which ones do we prioritize more? Which are the situations where we need certain vaccines? Or, this hepatitis B vaccine actually causes more problems than it's good, so that's not a good vaccine. Like we've done that in the past with the polio vaccine. The oral polio vaccine caused more polio than it stopped, so we stopped using it, right? Like that's the way we should be thinking about things. It's not just about protecting against one thing. It has to be overall health, and so I think we've missed that perspective when it comes to vaccines, and we only talk about the benefits and rarely the risks. And I think that's the point that you're getting at, which I completely agree. And then you can bring in all the other factors of your risk from the diseases, but I think just at a very basic standpoint, we have to look at all those 4 kind of places. And I think we're missing that long-term risk piece, which is very key to making those risk benefit calculations.
Yeah, and well, I wanted to share a couple of studies and kind of get your take on them. The first one is this 2003 study by Olesen. I don't know if you've read this one at all, but this was from Denmark, and it's 9,700 children, and they were looking at from birth to 3 to 15 years. And the one thing that people are going to point to is that it's a parental questionnaire, but my typical thought is trust the parents. Um, because I think that when people don't trust their parents or the patients, I think you run into a lot of problems. I think that not that every patient is always 100% reliable, but I think you should start from there at least. But this was the confounder adjusted incidence ratio of atopic. This was just looking at atopic dermatitis amongst MMR vaccinated children versus not. And they found, basically an 86% increased risk, increased incidence. And then I think for me, the more interesting study even is this one that they did. It's sometimes called the Steiner study. You've probably heard of this one, 2006, where they compared 6,600 kids, again, similar age range, looking over 5 European countries. And they focused here on the doctor diagnosed disease. And and you probably find this one interesting. Use of antibiotics during the first year of life associated with increased risk of rhinoconjunctivitis, almost twice as likely to have that. Asthma, 2.8 times as likely, so close to 3. Atopic eczema, 1.67, so 63% more likely. And then using antipyretics, fever-reducing medications, also increase risk of asthma by about 54% and atopic eczema by 32%. So, that's pretty interesting. And it's not just about the vaccination, right? It's about a lot of these treatments where you see that early intervention with a lot of the things that we assume are going to be healthy things, I think are not necessarily as healthy as we thought.
Yeah, that to me, and just stepping back and getting rid of the research for a second, in a common sense perspective, I feel like the more that we intervene on kids, the more likely it is that we might muck something up. I mean, you can protect them from things, but you can also have negative side effects. And I think that that's one of the downsides of all the modern medication and medicines that we have. I mean, sure, if you need an antibiotic, well, it's good if you don't die from pneumonia, right? But I think that there's still a negative consequence of that, and there's I'm sure a negative consequence to your body in general from the pneumonia, and then also from the medications. And so that's sometimes where it's hard to kind of parse it out, because for all those people that are taking a medication, an antibiotic or whatever, there was some other reason why they needed it. So that's where the prospective studies really come in, because you could say, well, maybe it was actually the fever that caused the issue and not the medication. But ultimately, I think it's probably both. And probably anything that you need to do to your body that changes the gut microbiome, that affects things, that affects your immune system, could have a downstream negative effect in terms of a chronic condition, because you're changing things. You're changing your body and the system and everything that ultimately could lead to things getting into an imbalance, and that leads you towards having these other issues. Or maybe those are people that are more likely to take medications, and taking multiple medications over time leads you to, well, whatever the reason is, I don't know. But I just think that makes a lot of sense, and vaccines should be kind of included in that.
Well, I think that with regard to the antipyretics in particular, you actually there's two things I would point out. The first one is that we know that the one most commonly used in early stage pediatrics, at least, is acetaminophen, Tylenol, right? And we know that that depletes glutathione levels. And we know that glutathione is responsible for a lot of not only protective effects, but also, chelation elimination for the body. And so to me, my question would be, um, you know, the influence of that to me seems like a pretty clear mechanism. That plus we also have studies showing that if you take antipyretics in like a self-limiting upper respiratory tract infection, they tend to prolong the infection by an average of, in some studies, 1, in some studies, 2 days. And so, there's also the thought, well, if you're actually decreasing time to viral clearance, which is, we know this is what happened during COVID, where basically you have more virus active for longer, increased risk of autoimmunity, increased risk of, frankly, damage from the virus. So, I mean, I think there are plausible mechanisms for these things that we are aware of, and that I think to a large degree either ignoring or just sort of, yeah, I mean, just consciously being like, oh, well, we're going to dismiss that because a fever is inconvenient for, you know, a 2-year-old. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question we use way too much medication in America and around the world. And I think that's a factor of marketing and kind of a lifestyle where we're like, we want something faster, easier, simpler, get back to work, get back to school, get our kids' fever, way a little bit faster. And for so long, it just was ignored, I think, in terms of like, well, what could be the downstream effects of that? What could be the negative complications? We just didn't really, I don't think most people thought about it. Like, oh, just take Tylenol, it's fine. Right. Oh, fever, take Tylenol. And it's like, okay, it doesn't mean that it can't be beneficial sometimes, but we don't think about what the negative complications might be. And I would imagine that, taking Tylenol once in your life, probably not the end of the world, but could it affect your body? Could it affect your system? Could it? Of course it could. Like, your body's doing something because it's doing something. Like, it's trying to get rid of the disease. So you're stopping it from doing what it's trying to do, and you're stopping the fever, which has a positive effect in general for your body in terms of getting rid of the disease. So yeah, you're doing things. So why couldn't that have some negative effect? Certainly in some people, everyone's genetics are different. Maybe it does something that we don't quite understand, or it does exactly what we understand, but that just leads to negative downstream effects. Like, we know a lot about it, and there's a lot that's been written, but it's just not the common discussion. It's like, oh, just take a medication. I think that's just the way that we are, and that just has to change. And you look at, and I just posted about it, I think, like, we in America use like 90% of the pain medicines around the world, right? Like, it's just, this is just normal here. Like, with ADHD meds, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, like they have their place and they can be life-saving, but we use them way too much. Or just antibiotics is like very simple. You know, we use, I'm sure, way more antibiotics than anybody in the rest of the world. And
Right.
most of the time it's a virus and it doesn't do anything. But obviously it could have some negative effects. It could affect your gut. There's a lot of good bacteria in your body, and we're just blasting that with an antibiotic. Now, it doesn't mean if you have a pneumonia in the hospital, you shouldn't take antibiotics. That's a different
Sure.
situation. But it's all about risk versus benefits. And a lot of times we never think about the risks. We only think about the potential benefits. Like, oh, ear pain, here's an antibiotic. Oh, sore throat, here's an antibiotic. And I think that giving antibiotics is something that can cause a problem for you. It can, if it's, you know, if you get unlucky. So I think that like those studies say, like, it doesn't increase your risk like 100 times. Like, oh, you take antibiotics, your kid's gonna have asthma, but it probably does increase your risk a little bit of having long-term complications. And that's why we've seen such an increase in chronic disease, because it's a little bit of antibiotics, it's a little bit of reflux medications, it's a little bit of vaccines, it's a little bit of lead and arsenic and it's just all these little things that are all chemicals that we just never really were exposed to forever in human history. And now we're getting them all at once, and it just expresses itself in different ways for kids. And it's not simplistic. It's not all vaccines. It's for sure not. But they're just one piece. And I think if we can look at it from that perspective, then we can start to decrease some of these things from our kids and think about it in that light as multifactorial. And I think that will help in the future to kind of decrease chronic disease a little bit, because we would start to decrease these exposures, and maybe prioritize certain vaccines or certain medications or certain situations where we really value the benefit and we understand the risk, but we're just willing to take that risk.
Yeah. Well, the way that my mentor described toxicity, Dr. Walter Crinnion, he said that you think of it as like a barrel and there's a constant drip of toxins. And eventually, if you don't let out some of the toxins at the bottom, it's going to overflow and you're going to develop symptoms. And the problem is that the outflow, which is our detoxification process, is highly genetically variable, highly nutrient dependent, and that is where we run into a lot of the problems. I'm wondering, speaking of what you just said, being more, I guess, discerning or assiduous about what to do when, you know, on a practical day-to-day level, are there certain vaccines where you're like, oh, we don't do that in this practice, or are there certain ones that you're like, oh yeah, these are the ones that I really make sure to push? Like what are your hot takes on those? Because I know, my pediatrics professor, who is an MD, she said, and she practiced pediatrics for decades. She's like, yeah, the rotavirus vaccine was, basically a money-making scam, unless you live in Kashmir. It's like, because nobody dies from infantile diarrhea in the United States. So that just as an example.
Yeah, my perspective in the office, in the book, when I talk, it's always the same, because I just don't feel like I should be telling people what to do. I feel like it's my job to educate and inform and discuss and try to help people to make the best decision for them. And I think that it would be super arrogant of me to be like, well, Dr. Joel knows better than the CDC, so you should, not do this one and do this one. I think that there's a lot of people that have studied this for a long time that have come up with a schedule. And ultimately, if you want to stick with the baseline, then the CDC or whatever, country public health schedule, that's what you can do. Anything outside of that, I think, becomes personal choice. And I think that you have to weigh the risks and the benefits for yourself. And that's why understanding the risks from the diseases, I think, is really important. So you can kind of weigh those things for yourself, and ultimately understand the risks from the vaccines would be really helpful. So you can really make a truly informed decision, but you have to make a decision based on what we know. And so when I'm talking to families about slow schedules, which is pretty common in the office, and we have people do the regular schedule, some do slow schedules, some do none. I don't force people to do anything. I don't believe you should be forced, but I think we should be able to talk about it. And I'd say a lot of people do a slow schedule. So usually they weigh it by, well, what is actually around and what could kill you in general. And so that's usually what people think of it. And whooping cough, especially for babies, it's around, could be very severe. As you get older, it's still around, but generally not as severe. Still not fun if you get whooping cough, but most adults, is not going to kill you. Pneumococcus you could get, it could kill you. Haemophilus you could get, it could make you really sick. Measles you could get, it could make you really sick. So those are the ones that I would say people tend to prioritize over the others for younger babies. I mean, polio hasn't really been around for a long time in America. Hepatitis B, you're very unlikely to get. Chickenpox, usually more mild. Rotavirus, like you said, usually more mild. So that is generally how people kind of prioritize those, but everyone's different. I mean, maybe you have hepatitis B, so that's a more priority for you, obviously for your baby. But I think for the majority, those are the ones that people would debate and kind of discuss and what they would be thinking about. But so again, it's a little bit of personal choice because you have to decide like, well, do I want the risk of Haemophilus influenza? Like only a few people get it every year, but if they do get it, it's very severe. So you have to think about that.
Sure. Well, and are you going to be paying attention, and are you going to pursue, the appropriate antimicrobial treatment right away because you have a great relationship with your primary care doctor versus are you avoiding? See, that's the irony, right? Is like a lot of people who would avoid the vaccine would also avoid going to the doctor until maybe it's too late to use antibiotics. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
I think the hard part is that like whether you have a good relationship or not, you're unlikely to know that it's one of those things early on. Like if you
sure.
go and start having symptoms, like you're not going to know it's Haemophilus influenza unless you're in the hospital and having seizures and like really sick, and then they're testing you for all sorts of weird things, and then they realize it's that. Like it though that's the problem is like might be treatments or some things, but often you wouldn't know. Like even let's say whooping cough, you have a little cough, you're not going to know it's whooping cough until it's too late.
It's
And
so
like
funny, Maddie in her first pregnancy, um, probably about 2 or 3 weeks after she had been scheduled to get the whooping cough vaccine and didn't get it, developed the whooping cough. She got pertussis, and basically, when I knew it was pertussis, when she was
Wasn't
cough,
scheduled. I don't think so.
well, what I mean is when it's normally would be given,
got it.
right? And the moment I knew that it was pertussis, we were watching a movie and she was coughing and then she vomited while she was coughing. And I was like, oh crap, like so, you're right that, in the early stages. And then she did take, and, she took azithromycin, which is the safest one to take if you're pregnant. And but yeah, I mean, I think that it can certainly happen, is the point. And having a doctor as a husband, no doubt, helped her get treatment as fast as it was reasonable to be treated. But I can imagine that I do think about that. I think about, for patients that are unvaccinated, because I've heard stories, for example, of like meningitis paralysis and in people in their late teens, early 20s, going off to college, not vaccinated against meningitis. And to me, when I have a patient that chooses not to get vaccinated, that is in that age group of going off to college, I give them a list of all the symptoms. I give them a mnemonic to remember. And I say, look, if you have any of these, you need to go straight into the hospital and get IV antibiotics because, you don't wait and see if you're body's gonna fight it off at that point. So
Yeah,
that is all part of, say
that's a tough
again.
one. It's a meningococcus is a tough one of all of them because it's so fast. It's
Right.
like very unlikely a teenager is going to be like, "Oh yeah, I think I have meningococcus. I better go to the hospital." Like in the first day or that night. Like it's
Sure.
so. And I think you just make a great point, and I just always that's why I think it's kind of a tennis match or whatever. It's like there are real risks for these diseases. Like they're not huge in general. I mean, even if you get most of the diseases, you'll be fine. They're usually pretty mild, but they could be severe. And ultimately, I think that's why informed consent is what's important because you have a risk from the disease and you have a risk from the vaccine, and you have to know what those risks are so you can make an educated decision. And we don't have a crystal ball, so you don't know what's the right decision. And you might be the one kid that gets measles and dies, or you might be the one kid that gets measles vaccine and has a bad reaction. So those are both
Right.
possible futures. And you have to decide what you're most comfortable with. And ultimately, everything has risk, and that's just life. I mean, there are 1,000 diseases out there that we don't vaccinate against that you can get and die from. So you can't just because we could do a vaccine doesn't mean we should. And just because we can do more doesn't make it better. But it doesn't mean you also shouldn't ever get a vaccine. So I think there's just a balance there, and the nuance is just rarely discussed, and it needs to be because that's the way that we, I think, bring back trust is in having these nuanced discussions so that people can make decisions. And ultimately, most people do decide to vaccinate anyways. Like there are very few people don't vaccinate. It's like 1%. So I think most people will choose to vaccinate if they're educated and they don't need to be forced.
I'm glad that we're here because I'm going to change the tide of the conversation a bit. Um, are you in private practice? You're in Studio City. Is it your practice? Do you call the shots? Are you the big boss?
I mean, there are three doctors here, but I started the practice. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Do you believe that? Because in your book you mentioned, some families come in and they know, doctor, give it all to me, give me all the vaccines, and you have this whole developing body of work, right? Your book, you've been interviewed several times, and you have a burgeoning social media page, and I've studied it extensively, and the family that comes in, doctor, give it all to me, has probably not been exposed to this body of work that you have so diligently created over several years. Like from that one moment where you met your wife and things started to happen to catalyze. Do you believe that in order to have like full informed consent, like these families must be exposed to all the information from each and every side, from the entire spectrum? And I really do believe that this leaves you as a physician between a shot and a hard place.
I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that I grapple with, because it's not like you can go through all the information in a book in a visit, right? It's like you don't have 3 hours to kind of sit there and go through every piece of information. So I think
Right, but do you offer this information to them, or is it a conflict of interest?
no, there's no conflict of interest. To me, informed consent is answering any questions that you can, and answering honestly, and providing as much information as you can within what families would want to know. I don't think you have the possibility of just giving people all information about everything, because that's just endless, and you don't even.
Yeah, I totally understand that. But a lot of families, a lot of people don't know what kind of questions to even ask.
I get.
I know as a
Yeah.
mother, as a practice manager, as a wife, you can bet that I know all the questions to ask. A lot of people don't. So
Yeah.
how do you really, you said you grapple with this. Like, what do you,
Yeah, like what I'm wondering what your actual process is. Like you say informed consent, and I'm curious to know, like, what does that look like? I'm coming into your office for the first time, as a parent.
Yeah, I think people have more questions when they come to the office. I think almost everybody that comes in is somewhat a little bit more skeptical, but we talk about it. We talk about vaccines, and mostly my patients at this point are all newborns. So there's plenty of time to have discussions on vaccines and kind of talk. But usually I try to figure out where they are first. So I'm talking to them and seeing where they are. I'm not trying to convince them. So if somebody comes in and they want to do all the vaccines, I'm not trying to convince them out of that. Or be like, well, you want to do the CDC schedule, but why don't you read my book first? And like, I don't ever bring that up, because I think anyways, that's a conflict of interest to try to be selling people something or make them read something, like, especially if it's mine. So that's not usually the angle that I would take. But I think for the people that are more hesitant is having conversations. A lot of times I'll offer like, oh, you have questions. Well, let's set up a visit outside. Let's do a telemedicine. Let's sit down for half an hour. Let's talk about your questions. Let's go through things and answering them. So I think the best way that I can do it in the office is to answer questions as much as I can and be as honest as I can and go through things in as much detail as people want. But to give people true informed consent on anything is not, it's not really possible. I just think it needs to be available. Like, I think informed consent and the information needs to be out there for people to get educated if they want to. But I don't really see how, as a physician, you could give people all the information on anything, because I don't know what that even means. Like, I think, and I think, so I get your point. Like, you could be like, all right, well, you're coming in, well, oh, you want to get do you understand everything about the hip vaccine? Do you know the history on the hip vaccine? Do you know when it was studied? Do you know what's in it? Like, you could do that. And I mean, if you have 4 hours, but I think you have to do the best that you can within the time frame. But ultimately, to me, what separates reasonable from unreasonable is the doctors that are not willing to answer questions, or not look into things, or just kick people out because they have questions. I think for a doctor, it's your job to try to answer questions and become educated so you can answer them as informed as possible. But and it may be like, oh, if people have questions, well, here's some books that you could read, here's some resources that you could go to, and I think that's the standard, whether it's vaccines or anything. Like, I don't know how long you can really get into each thing in an office visit, and that's just the practicality of the problem with modern medicine in general. It's like, it's not just that. It's like, okay, well, do we have time to talk about nutrition? Do we have time to talk about sleep. Like you only have so much time in a visit. And even for me, I have private practice, I have more time, but it's still, still limited. I can't speak for 2 hours.
Thank you for that. So on that, I invite our audience to really get this, that the onus is on you.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and can I add to that? And that is
Yeah.
also one of the reasons why I've done so many more. Like I've written a book and done podcasts, and I'm continue to do
Yes.
podcasts and continue to talk, continue to do social media, because the answer to your question is it's impossible to do that, really. The only way to do it, as best as I know, is to put this information out there, as much of it for free, as much of it is available, or not expensive, or whatever it is. Like I do Substack, I do Instagram posts, write books, like all those things. And that gets to a lot more people than anything in my office. And most people in my office do, I'm sure, follow and like see some of the stuff, and they certainly get emails and whatnot. And so they have the option to kind of follow that and read those things if they want to. But that to me is the ultimate way that I can get information out as best as I can, because it's not even possible to do in the office. And even if it was, then I'd be helping 100 families, or 500 families versus thousands.
Totally appreciate that. So on that, I appreciate your entrepreneur like spirit, and you're so multifaceted, as an author, entrepreneur, physician, in private practice. Do you have a plan to eventually step away from private practice and just like unleash your voice?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I like practicing, and I think it's a good thing when it comes to this world, because you kind of have one foot in both. You can understand the questions that people have. Ultimately, with all this stuff that I'm doing, I've had to very much decrease what I'm doing. So I'm just not in the office all that much compared to what I used to be. And so it's more part-time than full-time, but I'm here enough that I can see the patients, and I just don't take that many more patients. So I can be here for the ones that I do have. And also with technology, thankfully these days, it's like you can do a lot more telemedicine and a lot more without actually being in the office, which is super helpful. So I don't know. I mean, maybe one day, I mean, I am trying to do more online, trying to do more writing, Substack, Instagram, and then hopefully more policy stuff. And I've been trying to be more involved. So I think one day, probably, yeah, I'll probably stop. I think most, every doctor does, but I don't think I don't plan to stop practicing for a while at least. But if ultimately it may be, I have made no choice, depending. But it's hard, because I think people don't realize, like, the vast majority of what you do is for free, or you're spending your money. Like I go to a lot of things, like it costs me money. Sometimes I get paid, but not usually. You don't get paid for Instagram other than like a few cents. If a post goes viral. Sometimes people will sponsor something for a couple $100 or whatever, but it doesn't like cover what you do. So mostly I'm just spending money. So medicine actually covers things.
Pays the bills.
Yeah. So it's like it has to be enough to be able to stop, and it's not that easy to do.
Yeah. There was something that I wanted to touch on before you keep going down that road about the previous thing we were talking about. When I used to be in primary care practice, we didn't do vaccination in clinic, but we did. People would come to us. This was back a long time ago, before all the changes in the law, for exemptions. And before I would write an exemption for someone, I would always sit down with them with the vaccine safety data sheet from the CDC and literally go through it with them. And my office manager would get upset with me because I took too long with the patients, as you might imagine. But that is, I really can't imagine how you would do informed consent the way that sort of what you're talking about. I would almost call it like passive informed consent. It's like, hey, I'm here for you. I can answer your questions, but it's sort of up to you. But like active informed consent, where you're literally having, you almost would have to basically be like, here's the vaccine safety data sheet. Here's some other resources. Like, do your own research, and then when you're ready to move forward one way or the other, come back in and we can do that for you.
Here are the inserts.
Right.
I mean, I always thought the best way to do this theoretically would be if like, let's say the American Academy of Pediatrics could actually do something that was like really good and really actually informed consent, and kind of go through and be like, all right, every parent is getting vaccines, you should watch this video, like, and then you can point to that, and like that's just a part of it. But it would have to be like fair and reasonable, maybe done by different groups. But that would be more informed consent if you could say, like, all right, everybody should watch this half-hour video that's going to go through vaccines. We're going to talk about the different things. Here's the different questions you can ask. Here's some, bunch of different resources. But obviously, like, things like that are just super biased to one side, so it doesn't really work well. But ultimately, that would be actual informed consent, I think, like what you're saying, because ultimately that would be better, right? It would be really better if you could be like, all right, just go watch the or go read this one thing that kind of gives you all the information about everything, and that will really be one. Because again, it's like, oh, I tell people to read my book, like my book is biased towards what I think, right? It's like that doesn't mean that it's the right thing that someone should read or what everybody should read to get informed consent. Like I could be wrong.
Actually, you do a really fantastic job at. I know it's what you almost have to listen for underneath like what it is, what you actually write to because you sometimes don't blatantly say it because you don't want to tell people what to do, so I appreciate that. And I it was adventurous just reading under, in between the lines and such.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly things you can take out of it that you can read through, you can read between the lines, you can kind of see what I think, but like ultimately, I still don't want people to do what I think. They have to do what they think, and you might weight things differently at the end of the day. But to do what you're saying would ultimately be best. But it's
Yeah,
doesn't.
so here's the thing though. I mean, you gentlemen are experts that people defer to.
But you can't defer on this. Like that's the thing, is you can't tell somebody what to do in this situation. It's
Right.
like a cancer treatment. The
Right.
cancer the
That's a
cancer
great analogy, actually.
can come to you and say, look, like you have X, Y, and Z cancer. We think this chemotherapy is going to be beneficial for you because of X, Y, and Z. Here are the risks. Here are the benefits. Do you want to do that? It might save your life, but it also might kill you. Which route do you want to take? And the person gets to choose. They don't tell you that you have to do chemo. They say, here's what we offer. Do you want to do it?
Well,
Unless
most of them don't tell you have to do
yeah,
chemo.
I mean, you're not supposed to, but it's like elective surgery, like, oh, you could do this, you don't do it. If you're in the
Right.
hospital in the emergency room, like they might just treat you because you can't speak about it. But like a vaccine, let's say it's elective, it's not required, technically. So again, it's like you have the choice. And I think this is the way I think of it is that I think our job is to educate, is not to force, especially things that are elective. And we shouldn't be telling you what to do. Like I
Thank you
shouldn't be
so
telling.
much for saying that. Thank you. Hold on. Thank you so much for saying that. So again, I'm going to invite our audience to really be with um, where is it that you're outsourcing and deferring to and not taking self-responsibility for? What is there to take a look at? Um, that that is what I want for everybody, and I think we're really, yeah, really aligned in that that way. Take a look. Like, here's the information, and I'm here to answer any questions that you have. Ask away.
Yeah. And I gotta run in 2 minutes because I got patients. But I just want to say, like, and that is different. Like what you mentioned is so different than a situation where a kid has a bad pneumonia and I think might die. Like that is very different. But like you need to take this antibiotic, right? Like, or you need to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
That's where I think that line is different from a doctor telling you what to do, versus offering you options. Because I think it would be wrong to be like, well, would you like to take this antibiotic for your kid's bad pneumonia because they might die tomorrow? But like, that's up to you, right? Like, no, I think you need to be strong in that situation and be like, you need this. This is a diagnosis. We need to do this. You need to go to the hospital right now. Like, no, it's okay. You could just like, no,
Sure.
you need to go there. Like that's your job, is to like educate the parents very strongly. But even then, they still could not do it, right? I mean, like even in a situation where somebody might die, like ultimately the parent can be like, no, I'm not going to the hospital, and I guess you can call child services if you want to, but ultimately at the end of the day, the parents get the decision on what they want to do for their kids. And that's the way that medicine has always been built, and it's supposed to be a partnership, and hopefully they listen to you and they trust you, but you're not telling them what to do.
Sure. I had two more questions for you. The first one is short. Have you heard of Dr. Erica Crumbeck, the naturopathicpediatrics.com? She
Mm-hmm.
has a program called Vaccines Demystified.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really great program. It's the best program that I know of that is like really down the middle, looking at both sides, pros and cons. She goes vaccine by vaccine. It's very thorough. It's not free, right? But that's the closest thing when you were talking about, I wish the CDC had something like this. I'm like, oh, that reminds me of Erica's program. So I'm glad you've heard of her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the My last question for you is which is a question I hope to ask all of our guests, which is in your area, which is, pediatrics, and I think for parents in general, like what would be the three things that you would advise parents to do or to take on if you could just give blanket advice to optimize children's health? What would short version?
Yeah, I mean, the short version, you kind of mentioned the first one is we have to take health back into our own hands. You have to realize that doctor's visits are more about treating you for things than they are really about preventing or kind of diving deep into a lot these days. You just don't have that kind of time. So it really is up to each parent to really dive into this. I think that's one. Number two, reading labels. Super important to have a health mindset when you're purchasing things. Food, food especially is really important. I think we just don't eat very healthy these days. And then the last one is we're just surrounded by too many chemicals and toxins. So being mindful of everything that you purchase and bring in your home and put on your skin, super important. So we can at least decrease that toxic load a little bit wherever you have that option to do so. And I think that adds up to being beneficial overall.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us.
Hold on. Do you have time for 2 minutes?
2 minutes, yes.
Okay. I'd love to have you on for another session.
Sure.
Are you open to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. As a Jedi dad, with everything that you know and all of your experience and all of your love, what are you committed to imparting to your Padawan son?
I think one of the big things is just having a healthy mindset and just understanding that health is an important part of our life, and it's not really about money or other things, but just spending time with family and enjoying the small things in life. I think that's really important. And just really imparting that mindset that I didn't even really grow up with because it wasn't really part of my mindset, but I think it's super important as we move forward, especially in the world as toxic as it is, that I've seen the big difference it makes for the families that actually are mindful, that certainly have lower burdens of chronic disease in general, which is really important.
Thank you, Dr. Joel, for your candor and your authenticity, your generosity, and the powerful work that you do.
Thank you for having me on.
This has been a fantastic episode of the Partovi Effect. Thank you so much for joining us.
Dr. Joel Warsh, Dr. Ryan Partovi,
And Mrs. Madi Partovi.
be well.